February 25th, 1997. The survivor is Ilse Steinhardt Rose. The interviewer is Bernice Borison. The interview is being conducted in Canton, Massachusetts, USA, and the language is English. Could you tell me your name?
Ilse, I-L-S-E, Ida, I-D-A, Steinhardt, S-T-E-I-N-H-A-R-D-T, Rose, R-O-S-E.
What was your maiden name?
Steinhardt.
Have you ever been known by any other names, nicknames?
Ille, I-L-L-E. My parents called me that.
And your birth date?
January 8th, 1923.
And how old are you now?
74.
Where were you born?
In Hanover, Germany, H-A-N-N-O-V-E-R.
And what was the largest city near Hanover?
And Hanover was the largest city in where I lived.
And what country?
Germany.
Where did you grow up?
I lived for the first 7 years of my life in Hanover, and in 1930 we moved to Nuremberg. And it's spelled in German, it's N-U umlaut R-N-B-E-R-G.
Why did your family move from Hanover to Nuremberg?
On account of my father took over my grandfather's business, which was janitorial supplies, and it was a very good business, and my grandfather got ill. He wanted my dad to take it over. Added to his other business that he had in Hanover, which was the same idea.
Your father worked in both Hanover and Nuremberg?
No, once he left Hanover, he conducted it from Nuremberg.
How large was his business?
It's a very good business. I was sort of young. Didn't mean anything much to me.
Did your mother have a profession?
Not that I really know that she was educated, and her father, who died rather early, but was in business with his brothers and brothers-in-law. They had a bank in Marburg, M-A-R-B-U-R-G, that was also in Germany, and that's where my mother was born. And that's where she lived with her children. She became a widow in 1902 with 3 children with my mother's side. And my father was born in Würzburg, W-U-B-E-R-G, and also Germany. And they met in 1918 and were married in 1919 in Marburg.
What was your father's name?
Justin Steinhardt.
And your mother's name?
Teresa Steinhardt. She was known as Tessie.
How many children did they have?
2. My brother, who was 2.5 years older than I am, and me.
What was your brother's name?
Fritz.
Can you describe your home to me?
It was very lovely. Had everything in it that people of that stature would have. They were married, and like I always say, my mother had a maid, and she started, and when children were born, we had a governess, and when Mother came here to this country in later years, she said she has more time now than she had to go and watch over the people that they did the work and so on and so forth, because life was a little different in Germany.
Can you describe your apartment?
was a large apartment, and it had a living room, dining room, what you call here a den. We children had our rooms, and the maid had her room. My parents had their bedroom, and it was a large stretch-out apartment, kitchen and bath, and it was very pretty.
What about the furnishings? How was it furnished?
Always on a modern type or whatever, in good taste. You know, when I was young, you know, you don't realize it, but when I look back and think back, it was very pretty. I don't have any pictures of those things. I have some linens that I knew exactly where all these different things belonged to, because at that time you had like a server that was big and was sort of fairly sized. And my daughter, I just saw it in her house. She has that big lace cloth, or very fine, that belonged on that table. So I remember these things so well.
Were there any ritual objects, religious ritual objects in your house?
Yes, we kept a kosher house, and matter of fact, my spice box is over there in the little fragrance that came from our house. But these are all, the rest of the things that I had in my house are quiet new, because all the silver and all expensive belongings and pictures and gold and jewelry, all my parents lost. That had to be delivered. Either delivery had to bring it, and so therefore very little has been brought out.
Did your father use the spice box?
Yes, occasion, and not all the time. We weren't quite that religious, but it came from his father's house. So.
What did your parents do on Friday nights, Saturday?
We lit the candles. We had Friday night, you know, dinner, and so, but not necessarily chicken, because that was, we didn't know that until we came here, that Friday night is chicken.
What did you have?
I would make flanken soup and things like that. It was good dinner.
Did your father or anyone in the family go to synagogue?
Yeah, we belonged to synagogue. But, and you went to synagogue? Yeah, sure.
How often?
Quite often, Shabbat. Yeah. You know, I was so young at the time that when I realized it, it was very hard. That's what I remember more, though, than when I was 7, when I came to Hannover, to Nuremberg, I should say. And I remember going with my grandmother and grandfather, but my grandfather died in 1934 by the side. And my grandmother from my mother's side did not live in Nuremberg. She lived in Marburg. We went there on vacation in the summertime, and she came to visit us. We were very close with her. She was alone. She lost her husband as a too, and never remarried. And she was religious. She kept it also strictly kosher. And we ceased having a kosher house when you couldn't get any more meat. Buy it in Germany starting in 1934.
When you wanted to eat kosher meat, it came in from South America.
And my father, and I remember one time, he wanted to get a duck. He grew out in the country and brought the duck home in a burlap bag, and the neck stuck out and too much noise.
And we put it overnight in a bathtub.
And we kids had more fun with that thing. But when the shochet came the next morning, I left out. I left the house. I couldn't stand that. But, so you know, you didn't have kosher meat anymore. And somehow or other, things changed dramatically anyways.
What language did you speak at home?
German.
Can you tell me something about the Jewish community?
Again, I belonged to a sports club, Habanim, and as far as the Jewish community is concerned, you went to synagogue and so on and so forth, but things really, you met Saturday afternoon with your family, whatever. There was my grandmother, but we never had really a lot of family around because mother came from another town and dad was in Nuremberg, but he had only one sister who lived in Berlin. And so it was mostly friends that you get together with a coffee clutch on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon. And when you talk about Sunday afternoon coffee clutch, I remember I was 10 years old. That's when Hitler gave his famous speech in 1933. And that he also, in that speech, it said that no maid or cleaning help, whatever you had, cannot be under 45 years of age, working in a Jewish house. I'm talking about a woman. And so I remember very lightheartedly say, my mother, well, I'm so glad Louise is older than 45. We didn't realize or ever had a thought that things would happen, what did. And at that time, things, we're not taking that seriously. But that's where it came from.
Were you frightened in those days?
I was too young, 10 years old, but I didn't have, from then on in, I didn't have a good youth, because in 33, 34, you started to see, you went skating, suddenly you couldn't go skating because it said a sign, no Jews allowed, whether you went swimming, whether you went ice skating, whether you wanted to go to any kind of a gym, and you just couldn't do it. Little by little, didn't come all at once. And so this we had. And I had one incident, for instance, that I remember so vividly. And that was in 34, I was 11. And I walked to school every day with another girl, her same name is Ilse. And we lived very close by. And one day, this other Ilse's mother came to my mother and said, Mrs. Steinhardt, I want to tell you, my Ilse cannot no longer walk with your Ilse to school. My mother said, why? She says, because my husband has a custom tailoring business, and he is now making SR and SS uniforms. And if my daughter is seen walking with your daughter who is Jewish, that would reflect on my husband's business, and from that on, I never saw that girl again. And it became very uncomfortable being in school all around. And finally, we had a Jewish, which was mostly what they call Jewish Realschule, which is like the elementary and further, which were mostly Jewish teachers. We had one teacher, I remember, he was not Jewish. I think he was an atheist, I don't know. But that's where I went. We had to go to school because it was just not feasible for us to go into regular school.
What do you mean not feasible?
Well, you weren't very comfortable. And this way we went to Fürth, which is, I couldn't even remember the mileage, how much that would be, but like, say, not as far as Newton to Framingham, but say maybe Newton to, well, what's there? Wayland, maybe 10 miles. I don't know exactly. But we had to travel by streetcar to go to that school. And there we were all amongst Jewish children.
Was it safe traveling in the streetcar?
Yes, at that time it was.
What about the other people in your town? Were a lot of them, were they religious like your family and not or more assimilated? What were they like?
Well, we had, at the time, we belonged to a conservative temple, synagogue. There was a large Reform temple, in Nuremberg, and there were also some Orthodox shows in Nuremberg.
Were there any famous, well-known people in your town
Not that I know of.
that became famous from your town?
Not that I know of. My schooling ended when I was 14.
Why was that?
Because that's just as far as you could go to school, really. And that was, let's see, that was 37. That was 1937. At that time, it was very difficult. And if people were lucky enough to come to America and take some things with them, including money, then those children and the parents could afford and had the time to go to school in America. But I went to work at that time in a Jewish millinery establishment, and I learned how to do, was a apprentice, what would you call, in milliner, do hats and things like that. And I learned that, and things like that.
Could we just go back to when you were in school, when you first went to school? How did the teachers treat you in school?
At first they were fine. At first they were fine, but you just never know. Everything was watched, and they couldn't, that was just the rules and regulations. I really can't tell you. You know, one has, sometimes you want to live and you want to wipe things out. And I think that's what happened to me, that they were very strict. Now in here, when you have somebody crossing the street, we didn't have that in Germany, that somebody helped you cross the street, you watched out yourself. You were scared of the policeman, you were scared of the teacher, you were always scared.
Why was that?
Well, because they just, like, I had one teacher, it was much stricter, the schooling. I had one teacher, we had all the door openings were not with a knob, but with a handle, like we have it nowadays. When he came into the door, he slammed that handlebar down, that you heard it. And at that point, you had to stand up next to your chair in like attention, like you're in military school. You know, this is the kind of strict, you wouldn't dare talk. And if you did, you got punished with a bamboo, with it, rod, and things like that. Here, the policemen are the children's friend. The teachers, it became here now, they call each other by first name, which...
Were your teachers ever anti-Semitic to you?
Not really that I know of, but because the whole thing was strict, you know, so I didn't suffer by that.
Did your parents have much interaction with non-Jewish people
Not really, no.
before Hitler's
No.
rise to power?
No, not really.
How was the rise of Nazism perceived by your family?
Well, when your business get ruined, and you can't just pick up and go wherever you want to, I mean, how can you feel? Here, when you want to go out, you go out. You want to go in that restaurant, you go. Don't like it, you don't come again. But nobody will say you can't, even though somebody said to me that in years ago, they had signs up in New Hampshire, in certain places, country clubs, Jews not allowed. Well, anti-Semitism is still alive, unfortunately. It always will be.
What laws affected your father's business?
What laws, that it's when it came in that in all business like billing any kind of letterheads. Where it would say Justin Steinhardt and Company, it had to say Israel Steinhardt and Company. If they didn't, my dad had very good friends in business who did the buying. But when the invoices arrived with Israel, they could no longer do business with my father. Because if they were caught, and this was done, that people would sort of look through their books. They couldn't say anymore, I didn't know he was Jewish. Once the name Israel was on it, they knew, and that was the end of the orders. Because the women had to have Sarah in front of their name. And I was not there anymore when they started to wear Jewish stars. That was afterwards.
Do you remember if any of your father's non-Jewish business associates ever befriended him, or?
I wouldn't know anything about that. No.
Did you or your family know anyone who was a member of the Nazi Party?
When I look back, how do I know? I have no idea.
Where were you in Kristallnacht?
Kristallnacht, we were riding around in our car. My brother, who was in Munich at the time, he was supposed to come home, and we waited near the railroad station. My father soaped up the windows from our car, and we rode around the whole night in the car in order not to be home in case they should come. So that's what we
You
did.
knew that something was going to happen?
Oh, sure.
How did you know?
Well, because it just, the way the situation was at the time. Otherwise, I don't know how my father got the idea. I really don't.
Do you remember riding around?
Don't forget, we didn't have television. We didn't necessarily hear the radio. I didn't even know we had a radio. But it wasn't as popular as it is. Not in our house.
Do you remember when your father and mother said, we're going into the car?
Oh, sure. I mean, there was no question asked. We just had to go. And then...
What did he say? Do you remember?
No, I really don't. I didn't know that would make such an impact on our lives, what happened that night and thereafter.
What was it like that night?
Terrible. You know, would you like to ride around in a soaked up windows, cars that nobody can, you just looked enough out that you can see where you were going.
And what did you see?
What did I see? Nuremberg. I mean, we drove anywhere, so it didn't matter where, which road.
Did you see any of the violence or destruction?
No, we wouldn't go. We would go on the outskirts and so on. We wouldn't go downtown. And then, but we didn't really know what happened. Next morning when I wanted to go to work, you know, we came home at night and nothing happened in our house because my father came to America in 1906 to visit, until 1914. But unfortunately, he took out his first papers but didn't take his second papers. And when you get to be an American citizen and you apply for your first papers, you denounce the citizenship of your country that you leave behind. And that way makes you a man without a country. Stateless, they call that. Once you take out your second papers, then you're an American, which he never did because there was no mother standing behind him to say, Jake, you got to do this or that. And he went home to visit his parents, who he hadn't seen for 8 years. And he wanted to go home when he heard there was rumor of the war going on. And his father said, Jake, you haven't been home for 8 years. The war will be over in 2 weeks, and then you can go back. Well, the war wasn't over in 2 weeks, and he didn't go home. He never went back. So he was a man without a country. So therefore, we did not fall under the German quota or that they would come to our house. So it was a little protection. But later on, when we went to immigrate, we were under they were all quotas. We were under stateless quota.
You drove around all night on
Mhm.
Kristallnacht,
Mhm.
and the
Then
next.
we came home.
And
we came home.
what was?
We didn't find any damage in our
What about
house.
your neighborhood? What was that like?
There was all. We didn't see anything from the outside. We didn't know anything that happened because we lived on the outskirts. And but what I want to say, when I went to work the next day, I come in and I found that that whole business at millinery factory where I worked with, where they'd find hats and so on, that was completely demolished. I came home and that's the first thing. I knew that's when you heard from the radio and people talking what all happened in them. The businesses smashed, store windows smashed of all Jewish-owned establishments.
Did you see any of that?
Well, you stayed home that day, that's for sure. So,
Do you remember that day?
sure do, you know, of being scared and what will happen next.
What happened to your father's business that day?
Well, by that time, he already had given up his business, or the business had given him up, you know. It was just, and Dad, knowing the English language, what he seeked to do was, he gave English lessons for people who were immigrating to America. So he taught them how to speak English, because he always spoke English. And he was perfect in it. And that's, you know, that was that part. And we have family in Cincinnati who we're very upset about because they could have had a great help. They were financially very, very comfortable. And when my parents wrote to them, if they would be kind enough to send us an affidavit for the family, they had the audacity to send it to my father alone, not to the family. I have never yet heard of anybody that came over from Germany that became a burden to their affidavit givers, that they had to come to them for money. And we surely wouldn't have either. So my father had the affidavit, the papers in his pocket that he could leave, but it's a very hard decision for a man to leave his wife and daughter, you know, to go. Which, hindsight, it would have been the only thing to do. But you just don't think sometimes. And that's what happened. So.
We're going to change for a tape now.
Okay.
She is being interviewed by Bernice Borison on February 25th, 1997, Canton, Massachusetts, United States of America. The interview was in English. So your father did not, he did not want to leave the family, and he didn't?
Not at that point.
So then what happened?
What happened? After Kristallnacht, which was November 9th, 1938, there was children's transports going out of Germany. And as I was already 16, January 8th, 1939, I was not able to go with the children's transport per se, because you had to be under 16. But my mother was able to manage to get me across because my mother's aunt had an uncle who had a brother who lived in Brussels, Belgium. And my mother had written to him. He was a man in the early 40s, who was working for Shell Oil. He said, if you can get Ilse across the border, I will take care of her. And this is how I left Germany, March 7th, 1939, to Belgium.
He didn't want to take your brother also, just you?
My brother, he was 18 and a half. He couldn't go with the children's transport. Okay, he was too old. And
do you remember when your parents told you you were going to be leaving
You
them?
want to know something? You became numb. When I think back, when I said goodbye to my brother early in the morning, 6:30, I figured I'll see him in a few months. I never saw him again. I said goodbye to my mother and father at the train station, and I went to Brussels. I was picked up by this man who was very kind, and he brought me to the school, which was a pensionnat, and it was just lovely, very nice. I didn't speak one word of French, and I had to learn that. And he left me there, but I was in constant, he was caring for me, and the people were very, very nice. I went to school there, and we went along. I learned to speak French. It's amazing how you pick it up and you learn it. You go to school. Then came September 1st, when war was declared between Germany and
Do you remember the day the war broke out?
September 1st, 1939, between Germany and England.
What was that? What do you remember about that day? Where were you?
That my mother, I was in Belgium,
Where?
and at home in that pensionnat. And my mother called, I believe, that my father is leaving that night. He had his papers, and he left Germany that night. My mother was a very strong individual. She said, Jake, you have to go. You have to go to America, and we have to try the last we can do, that you send us the papers to come. And my father called me then that he was going to come, that he's going to see me. And he came, and when he left Germany, when you crossed the border, which was in Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N, which is the town which is on the border, they beat my father black and blue. But he came to Brussels.
Why did they beat him?
Well, because he was a Jew, and he left. But they had to let him go. He had his papers. And he spent with me, I think, about 3 days.
Did you see him beaten up?
No, ma'am.
I mean, did you see?
Oh, sure I saw it. How can you not? And he left 3 days later from Antwerp by boat. I followed him.
Could we just go back to when you took that train from Germany to Belgium?
I didn't, from children's transport.
What was that like?
A whole bunch of kids crying, weeping.
Were you crying?
Yeah, I think I must have.
Do you
But
remember?
you know what?
Do you remember saying goodbye to your parents?
I said goodbye, but never would ever anybody have thought how long it takes until you see him again. I didn't see my mother until May 7th, 1941, until she came here.
And how long did it take, the transport?
It isn't very far, you know. I really don't know how
Do you know
many
who
hours.
traveled? Were there adults traveling with the children?
Oh, sure. Yes, they do. There were a whole bunch of kids, I mean. They were below, can be 6, 7 years old, too. And
Did you
and
know
10.
anyone?
No, not one. I was just lucky to be pushed in with this.
And when you arrived in Brussels, was it a Jewish organization that you stayed
of course. No, the pensionnat? No. That was non-sectarian. It was a private thing. My uncle, I called him uncle. She wasn't, but called him uncle.
What was that year like for you without your family? Did you?
Very difficult.
In what way?
Well, if you don't see your mother and father, you no relatives, you just get thrown together. But there were other children there who came the same way, but not that I knew them. One came from Frankfurt, and one came from Vienna, and they were in that same pensionnat, and we became friends. And
Are you still in touch with them?
I think we were in touch with one in particular. She came from Frankfurt, but we lost contact, and I have tried to find her, but I have not been able to. But I did know that at one time she was quite sick, so maybe she died.
What was her name?
Marion Zimt. Marion Shoah when she was with me as a child, but her marriage name is Marion Zimt, Z-I-M-M-T. And she lived in Philadelphia. And when we were last year in Philadelphia, I called a woman who's been in Philadelphia also who comes from Germany. I asked her if she ever heard of this name, where I could find out. She tried everything. They just didn't die. They also had a place in Arizona, and I had their number. I called it. Phone is disconnected. So I don't know what happened.
So what did you do that year?
I went to school. It was sort of like an art school. And I had everything. I mean, good food, and I was taken care of. You know, this man paid for me, and when I needed something, he supplied me with money if I needed something. But my mother outfitted me as much as she could. And in March 21st, 1940, I left Belgium and I came to America.
Did you keep in touch with your family that year that you were in Brussels?
Oh, sure.
How did you
By
do
mail.
that?
By mail.
And did your parents or brother tell you what was going on in Hanover?
We lived in Nuremberg at that
Oh,
time.
Nuremberg,
Lived
right.
in Nuremberg. Not really, because you never know when it was examined, you know, that they would open up. And why they wouldn't want to burden me with worries, because there's nothing I could do about it.
And what happened when your father came for those 3 days when you first saw him? Do you remember
I
that?
was very happy to see him. You know, and we can't say we were glad to see each other. Whether we can't say we enjoyed ourselves, we just were glad to see each other. Because my father knew that's just for 3 days.
What did you do for those 3 days?
Oh, you just walked and you talked and you ate. It was not a vacation. It was, you know, when you have this in your mind, it's very hard.
What did you have in your mind?
Everything. When will I see my family again, if I will ever? It's difficult to speak about. So when I came here, 6 months after Dad, we started new life.
How old were you?
17.
How did you get to America?
By boat.
And was it difficult getting papers or a visa?
No, I don't think so.
How did
I guess.
How did you find out that you were coming to America then?
Well, my father and I, we were in contact. And he sent me the papers, and he had a good consulate. That's how you get your papers, and you get, you know, you had your passport.
Did you have to go to the consulate to get your papers?
You know something? I don't remember. I really don't.
Did you were you able to speak to your mother or your brother on the
Never.
telephone?
Never. Never. No. No, not until 1941, until I saw her.
Do
We
you
wrote
remember-
letters.
Do you remember the day you left Brussels?
I just got up early in the morning, had to go on the ship, and I was all by myself.
You were how old?
I was
16?
17.
17.
I was 17.
You went by
I
yourself?
was all by myself. I didn't know a soul on there. And then when I was on there, I met somebody from my hometown who happened to be on the same boat, who I didn't know of before, but when they said they come from Nuremberg, and then I said that I come from Nuremberg. But it, like I say, was not a joy ride. It was just a way to go, and you made the best of it. And I had funny experiences with a lot of passengers aboard ship were American students who were studying abroad. And due to the war, a lot of their parents in America wanted the children to come home. And here I was 17 years old, spoke German and French, and young men, and I had no idea what. It's just that somebody was watching over me. They said, would you like to come to our cabin? We teach you how to speak English. And I said, no, I don't want to. And, you know, these were things that it was just, I had as much knowledge about men and, you know, that, but something told me, you stay in your cabin, you lock your door. And that's exactly what I did. And the only time, it was very stormy. It was very scary anyhow, because you had to walk around with your passport on you at all times. All your papers you had to have on you, because you never know. Even though at night we had to go through the English Channel, the boat stood still because we had minesweepers, and that had to be, was always, they had to be put aside that the ship could go through, and we had a big mark on top that they could see overseas that this was a Dutch liner who was not in war. And so the cruising to America took 2 weeks. And people said, if you don't want to get seasick, you take an apple and you walk, put on coat, because it was March, it was cold. But take an apple and walk as fast as you can in fresh air and eat that apple, and you won't get seasick. And I think I was the only female aboard who wasn't seasick. I have a good stomach. And so these things, those things I don't, you don't forget this type of an experience. And then I arrived March 21st in Hoboken, New Jersey, and my father was there. And that's how I came to America. And then the life in America began. And I arrived on a Thursday, and by Monday, I already had a job. My father lined it up because we didn't have any money to take. I think I might have had $4, I don't know.
What happened to the money he had in Germany?
You couldn't take it out.
Where, did you ever find out what happened to it? Or?
Well, my mother needed money to live on, and my brother. I really don't know. There wasn't very much left, or they could take, only so much. And so then, on Monday, my first job was to be a maid in a when I think of it, in a one-room apartment in Brooklyn, in Brighton. A family. She was able to speak French, and I spoke French with her. And I learned to speak English. There was a baby, and I understand how these people hired me. What for? They had a one-bedroom apartment. I slept on the sofa, and this couple, they paid me $5 a week. I'd take care of the baby. I still don't know why they wanted me, but I didn't last long very much. Not very. I didn't stay there very long, about a week, until I got another job for $10 a week as a maid in a Jewish house, who were not very nice. But I had room and board, and I had $10 that I was able to give my father.
Where was your father?
He was here, and he was working, but listen, he had a furnished room that he had to pay rent for. And
did you see him often?
Well, we saw each other once a week anyhow, because that's when I had my afternoon off. That's when he would see me. And he had bought himself an old car with very little money at the time. In 1940, things went to hunky-dory here either. And he was always in business for himself, and he never could work for anybody. And he spoke perfect English, so he found himself in New York, because he arrived in New York. And he found himself a job to be a sales representative for a line of cheese. And later on, we we always teased him. I said, and you know, Dad, that business stunk. You know, and it did. It wasn't a good business. So,
Were you in touch with your mother and your brother?
yes, we were always by letter, by mail.
And what was
And we
happening?
tried to get affidavits for both of them, that we could vouch for them, that they would, and we got that far, that we got the affidavits for my brother and my mother. And when my mother and my brother had to go to Stuttgart, which is in Germany, that's where they had the American embassy, where they gave out the immigration papers, you know, the papers that you can immigrate. You go undergo a medical examination, and they gave my mother the papers, but they said that my brother had a heart murmur, which we never knew of, and he had plenty of examinations, you know, from a doctor. But we feel and we know that there was anti-Semitism even at the American consulate. If they could find the littlest thing, they would just find it. And they gave the papers to my mother and not to my brother. And it was a very hard thing. My mother didn't want to leave. But both my grandmothers, my mother's side, she lived in Hamburg. The other grandmother lived in Nuremberg. And they both insisted that my mother would go to America to join her husband, who she hadn't seen. And between mother and father, that they will be able to get my brother out. And they worked very hard at it. I don't know whether you ever heard of Nachum Goldman. Where my mother came from, Marburg, was a university city. And Dr. Goldman was a student there, and he knew my mother because my mother was a very bright lady. Anyways, she had Jewish boys and people who came from a small town and who studied in Marburg holidays, would have them. And Nahum Goldman, one of them, my mother wrote to him. Matter of fact, very same letter. Henry Schwab, who wrote a book, he letter. And
He was at the time with American Jewish Congress or something like that. And he wrote back, he says he's going to try what he can do. Really don't know, but the final thing is that my brother finally did get his affidavit, that he had his papers and everything ready, and the day he was to leave, that's when the law came out that no Jew with the age of 18 and 60 is to leave the country. So timing is your whole life, good or bad, that's what it is. And that's how we lost my brother, because he's deported. We got let and we never. But to me, she was my grandmother. She was lovely.
she was transported to Theresienstadt in 1943, I think. And she survived Theresienstadt. And my oldest daughter, who was born in 45, and she was 10 months old. So my grandmother came in 1946. And I think she died in 48, but I'm going to the cemetery to find whether she died.
And what about your grandmother?
My other, I'm not dreaded in Hamburg in 1943.
When mother come to America?
May 7th, 1941.
Did you correspond with your brother?
Not once he was deported.
No, once she came here, was she still in touch with your brother?
Oh yes, we all were in touch with him until he was deported. Mother came in 41, and he was deported in 43. I have all his mail that he ever wrote. I have it. I can't bring myself to read it too often. I can't throw it out. So that's...
What did he do during those 2 years when your mother was in America, do you know?
He worked, I can't tell you what kind of jobs he all had.
Who did he live with?
He lived in a room, and he was in very close touch with my grandmother. she knitted for him. I remember those letters. And when you wrote, you always wrote never really what you had to say. You sort of wrote, this is how the letters are. We knew what he meant. Like, I hope it's not going to be too cold. It's not going to be too hot. You know, these kind of things. We knew what he meant by that.
What did
The
he mean?
concentration camps. And my grandmother would knit very, very warm things for him. Helmets, like that your nose just isn't out, that you can breathe. And mittens, because she just didn't know you end up in death camps, you know.
When did you find out about the death camps?
Well, when you heard it here, and then we finally got notification that he died, which
No,
Red
yeah.
Cross notified us.
Did you know about the death camps when you first came to America, that there was extermination camps? Do you remember?
Of course not. Listen, we heard it when everybody else did. And you know what is so strange to us to this day? When we talk about this, that some people say, I didn't know what was going on. President Roosevelt knew what was going on because he swept it under the rug. They sent a ship back, right? People wrote, like we wrote, to 1936 to our family, who I said sent one affidavit for my father. They also say they didn't hear of it. Come on. We weren't the only one who wrote to America. And people say, we didn't know anything about it. So I do not want to get into argument with people because I cannot prove that they did know. But I think the rabbis, the Jewish organizations, they should have known about it.
What was it like for you when you first came to America?
Well, like I said, I had to start working, and I went from all different things as long as I could make money.
How were you treated?
By this last Jewish family, awful, very wealthy people. I will not give names. They owned 2 hotels. They had a beautiful house in Newton. And they had a 14-month-old child. I worked, I never saw a dog working, but people say you work like a dog. She woke me up in the middle of the night to go down and heat the bottle, to bring it to her so she can feed it to the child, 14 months. She was not an old lady. As I said, her husband owned 2 hotels. Every week she had a chambermaid come who helped wash kitchen floors, bathroom floors, and so menial work. Because I'd take care of the children, and I had to cook, and I was all 17. I told her I was 22. Otherwise, I never would have gotten the job. But I got $10 a week, and for $10, you lie. And I never forget, Mrs. Walsh showed up, maybe, for 4 or 5 weeks. And then one day she doesn't come. And I said, where's Mrs. Walsh? And she said, oh, she's not coming. She's not feeling well. You do the best you can. So crazy Ilse, she did the floors, she did everything. And that was the end of Mrs. Walsh for the same $10 a week. So never forget, family of theirs, I cannot mention the names, as I said, brought a pair of nylons. If everybody have a trivia question of when nylons came out, it was 1940. Because they brought her nylons and said, Ilse, here, wash these. And when I washed them, because you always wash stockings, silks, and rayons before you put them on the first time. I rinsed them out. Before you know it, they were dry. In the evening, I said to her, I can't believe these things are dry. I said, what is this? She said, it wouldn't interest you anyways, because you never have enough money to pay for those. When I stood in line, waiting during the war for nylon stockings, I was always hoping she would walk by, that I can say, see, I have enough money to buy these. So, and Oh, little episodes like that happen. We also, the family owned a summer home in Hull, which is Nantasket, Massachusetts. And this woman wanted to be a little different. She hired a place in Situate, which was, Jews were not very welcome there in 1940. She hired a place there. She didn't want to go to the family home in Hull. Ilse packed the car. Ilse did everything with a little help. We arrived that night, and when we got into this house, and we looked around, and she saw the pictures with the crosses and the holy pictures. And she took them all off the wall.
Stop. Tape.
Yeah. He touched you, that's why I know you.
Rose, February 27th, 1997. February 25th, 1997. Canton, Massachusetts. The interview is in English and she is being interviewed by Bernice Borison. You were telling the story.
So, the lady took down all these pictures that had crosses, and that was fine. It was her house. But my lady didn't want those there, and she put them all on the bed. In the evening, the woman who was the owner of the house wanted to welcome us, and she walks in, and she looks around, and she wanted to know where all those pictures were. The woman had to pull them out under the bed, and we were complimented out. And next day, we were lucky we could stay the night. The next day, we went to Hull. She was a very, very mean lady. In order to go to the beach, you had to take the children, the 14 months old, in the meantime, you were 16 months old, took them down with the little girl who was 4, took her down the beach. We had to climb a hill because it's sort of high ground there. And the little boy had a case of diarrhea. He had an accident. Well, I noticed it. I just picked him up, and the child, we started walking up, and I called up and I said, Mrs. So-and-so, would you bring a diaper down? Because he had an accident. She said, if you want a diaper, you come and get it. So when that was Wednesday morning, when I told my father what happened, he said, you pack your stuff and you go home. It broke my father's heart to begin with, to have his only child, a daughter who he pampered, that she's a maid, and he had them in Germany and paid for them. My mother was brought in luxury, you know, custom-made clothes, and so on and so forth, that I had to do that. So you can imagine what it did to him mentally. And that was sometime in July, and I went home. And from then on, I never went back into a household again. And in the meantime, you know, you learn to meet a lot of people, and German Jews who had the same experience of coming over to a country without money. You have to make money, earn a living, and they started, a lot of them were in needle trade. They didn't speak too much English at that point, so what can you do? A machine you don't have to talk to as long as they show you how to sew. And they had a funny incident. I worked on Essex Street in Boston. They made sportswear. And the man that hired me, people said, I answered an ad. It said, buttonholer, operator of a buttonhole machine. I never saw a button machine. They said, there is 2 different ones, Wilcox and Gibbs, and another name of machine. And whatever he tells you, you tell him you know the other machine that he has to show you. Well, by the time I come there, that job was already filled. He said, you know how to run a machine? I said, no, but if you show me. At that time, I could speak already a little English. You show me. And he showed me, and he hired me. And I learned to do stitching there. And I always saw people clipping off little papers and put into something. I didn't know what they were doing. And I was getting, at the time, I think, 30 cents an hour, $12 a week. And these other people were working so fast, and he told me to fast and do faster. And I worked my butt off. And then after a while, people said to me, "You're there now for 3 months, Ilse, you should ask him for a raise." Because I saw that I improved. And he spoke to me in Yiddish, and he said that he has Rachmanis of mir, and that I should be lucky that he keeps me. Well, I was afraid. I couldn't give up that $12 a week. Well, by Christmas time, he had no more work left, and I could see it. I had to go. I had to find another job. I went to another sportswear company on Harrison Avenue. They said, "How are you experienced?" I said, "Well, I know how to run a sewing machine." And he said, "Well, it's piecework." I said, "What is that?" I didn't know piecework. That was the little things they clipped off. So he said, "Well, this is the part you're going to sew over and over, and when you have a bundle, you clip off this thing because you're making the sleeves, and you put that in an envelope. And by the end of the week," he spoke Yiddish to me. He was very nice, this man. "And by the end of the week, we'll know what you earned." You know, the first week I earned $35. He just kept me because he had Rahman with me. He just had a cheap help. From then on, when people say, "Where are you working now?" I said, "When did I see you the last time?" Because I got better and better, and I was aggressive, and I worked hard.
This was when I think of this many times. I didn't get back to that I met my husband. They were married.
In 1942, we waited until my mother came, that he became engaged in 41, and we were married in February 42. And then I made that. I was
19 when I was married. And I made so much money in stitching.
We never had a honeymoon, her and I. That May 30th, 1942, I took him with my money to New York, and we stayed in a hotel in New Yorker, and we went to Statue of Liberty. Never forget it, because I thought I could walk up those things and look out. By the time you walk up May 30th, you didn't even have a chance to look out. You came home. I looked a mess. My heels were all chopped up. I wear a size 10 shoe. They were all chopped up from going down those steps. Have you been on Statue of Liberty? Don't bother. And
What about your mother coming to America?
well, that was a wonderful thing that she came, naturally. And she worked in a factory that I worked also. We made slip covers, and I got her a job. And she did folding of slip covers and things like that.
Were you still getting letters from your brother?
Yes, sure, until about 43, I believe.
And then what happened?
Well, then we didn't hear that we knew what happened.
You knew what happened?
When you don't hear, and you know that people were transported, we never got any mail out of concentration camp.
Did you know anyone from the town he was in who told you what happened to your brother?
No, nobody came out of that camp.
What was it like when time went by? How much time went by before you realized?
Oh, wow. When you don't get any mail, most years,
You knew what happened.
it's the same thing when we got mail. My grandmother always kept the address with her where we lived. And when we heard from her, we were delighted. And we could get the papers fast enough for her. And she came here.
When did she contact you?
As soon as she got out.
of the
Did you think that she was dead? Did you think that?
Well, of course, because we had no idea
So
what happened to these people.
what happened? How did...
Do you remember when you heard from your grandmother?
Well, because my parents sent papers.
No, do you remember when you heard that she was alive?
Must have been when they...
Do you remember that day that you...
No, not really. Not really.
We hoping, did the family think
We
that you...
always hoped, and that's why when we went the first time to Israel in 1970, you know, we could not go into Yad Vashem because all I'm looking, and whenever I see a picture, I still haven't seen Schindler's List. We have it here on tape. I will bring myself to look at it. But I'm always looking for my brother's face, wherever I go, and what I look, whether you've been there or not. I always look for his face. And life goes on. And my father was always a very innovative type person. He thought of starting a business at packaging candy in cellophane bags. Nobody ever did this before. And we started that. We sold those bags of candies to stores, grocery stores, drugstores, and it caught on beautifully because candy was actually a shortage because the war was going on, and the big companies who made candy, they supplied mainly the PXs all over the world, wherever they had, whether they're in this country or wherever. So they didn't bother with piddly things like this, but that's when Herbert, my husband, joined my father, and they did the business together, and then Dad bought also chocolate, like candies that we boxed, and we sold that too. And we made a living. We would load up the car in the morning. You bought gas for 50 cents. You fill up in the car. And you brought these candies to the drugstores, and they grabbed them with open arms because people wanted candy. And suckers, you know, hard candy and chocolate-covered candy. And that's when we learned all the different flavors. And I never heard of a molasses before, or spearmint gum, or wintergreen, and all this stuff. I don't like it to this day, but we sold it. And so that was one business. And then my mother and I decided, and well, this was going on. As I said, we packaged candy in boxes. But when the war was over in '45, the candy companies saw these packagings. And that's when they went, when they went into packaging, that put us out of business because they had lots of money to do machinery. We had a cellophane bag, and it was a very strange thing. We hired a garage that was on Orchard Road in Brighton. And what tickles me is I'm living now at Orchard Cove. Isn't that strange?
Could you tell me how you met your husband?
How I met my husband? When people come to America, you always find your own kind. And there was a German delicatessen on Commonwealth Avenue in Alston. And my husband being here without a family, he would go to this place to have a sandwich or to have something warm. They made meals there. It was not a big place. He would go there and eat, and he would meet other young fellows and girls. And my father, who was by himself, he had a room. He went there because he could speak to you. You could find your own kind that you can talk to, who had the same background, same miseries to deal with, and worries and so on. And one day, my father said, tomorrow I'm going to New York. I've got to pick up my daughter. And then a few days later, he brought his daughter. And there, my husband was there. We said hello, and so my husband really knew my father before he knew me.
And it wasn't until June, my dad had a car. He was very popular he was a nice man anyways, but he was very popular with some other people who didn't have a car. And when Dad said, and they were very kind to him, to invite him sometimes for dinner, and just nobody would have dinner parties or anything like that, but come over, we can talk. And he was people were very nice amongst each other. And my father said, well, why don't we go to the beach tomorrow? So this one lady said, well, why don't you ask this Herbert Rose? He's a single fellow, and that would be nice if he would go with Ilse. And that way she has somebody to talk to. And that's how I met my husband.
And what was your wedding like?
Oh, tremendous. We decided the beginning of the week that we're going to get married on Saturday night. And my father's birthday is the 22nd of February. And Herbert said, I don't want to get married on your dad's birthday because when Dad is no longer and we want to go and do something nice, you'll always. Didn't matter. We got married Saturday night, the 21st of February, 1942. There were
Rabbi Monk, and Rabbi Monk married my mother and father in 1919.
Was your wedding, was it sad? Was it a
was
sad
included
occasion?
5 people. There was my mother and father, friend of the family, and ourselves.
Was it a sad occasion that
My parents,
Like Herbert, he came from a nice family.
were you still in your brother?
Yes, yes. And we were also still in contact with Herbert's family. And my brother, just now, when we had our 55th anniversary, he sent us a card, and amongst other things, he said when we heard...
Your brother-in-law?
My brother-in-law, I should say. That when the family heard that Herbert got married, he and his father went into a bistro, Bottomsville. It's a glass of beer that cost 10 cents. And they toasted the young couple in America. And my parents, my mother wrote to my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and they congratulated each other. We had a letter from them, and that's the last we heard from them, because they were deported from Holland. That's not they've told you. So it lasted 55 years.
What did your business eventually end up being?
Well, there was a cookie business that Mother and I wanted to make some extra money for ourselves. So we started a cookie business. My parents lived in Austin. We lived in Brighton on the 4th floor. Ellie, who was born in 1945, she was a little girl. And we started to make cookies, and as I said, my father had always a wonderful sense of humor. There's some some cookies you make where you need more yolks, some you need whites, some you don't need any. And he said, well, you got too many yolks, why don't you give them to the streetcar conductor? And I get him down when he stops on Warren Street and ask to give them to me. You know, we always had fun. We tried to make the best of everything. Good sense of humor. And that's how we started that business, which grew, and we had a very nice business. We sold to better clientele, all delis, SSPSS, Jordan March. We made machine drop cookies, which we packed in tins, and we sold it to Crumbs, to Macy's in New York, to Wanamaker's in Philadelphia, Chicago, and we had a good business. But we added to that business. I always want to learn how to do cake. Whenever we served something, whether it was deviled eggs, we just never put it on the table. I learned that in my mother's house already, in my grandmother's house. You can serve a cup of coffee nicely, or you can just throw it on. It's the same cup of coffee. It doesn't cost any different if you serve things nicely. So being in the baking business, we heard from this supplier that a school that
is a well-known school in Chicago for cake decorating, Wilton School. They came for 2 weeks to Boston to this supply house to teach the bakers to decorate the cake, because if you make a layer cake and put some, say a Boston cream pie, you need an 8-inch layer cake or 10-inch layer cake. You put like custard in between and chocolate frosting, and maybe you got at the time $1.50 for that. But if you frost the whole cake and just the word happy birthday and a couple of flowers, you can get $4 for that very same cake. No extra ingredients, a little extra time. And that was the purpose of this cake decorating, to come to Boston, and which was helpful for the supply house, because they would sell cake decorating pans, they would sell the tubes, the bags. I mean, there's always something why they want to advertise that. And that's a course I took, which cost $150, which was a lot of money in 1951. But I wanted to take it. And that really saved our life, because we had business reverses, which I'm not going into, it's much too difficult, in 54. So we started that business in 1956.
The cake business?
And the cake business.
And how we started that business was?
There was the Boston Globe, the Herald, the Post. We cut out all the engagement announcements, Jewish Advocate. You can depict a Jewish name. They knew our cookies, which was the name, was Exquisite Cookies. And with that, I also was on television at one time with Mildred Carlson and Streeter Stewart on Channel 4 when we advertised our cookies. And that I sat by the telephone and I would call the following. Say you have a daughter who's in, her picture was in the paper, and you would say, it would say, Mr. and Mrs. Berenson of Newton Center, Mass. Announced the engagement of their daughter so-and-so to so-and-so, and August wedding is planned. And say this was January. Maybe January, February, I would call you up. I introduce myself. I say, this is Ilse Rose. I don't know whether you heard my name before, but my business is making wedding cakes. We used to be Exquisite Cookies, and I wonder if I could interest you. And at that time, in 1956, in 1960, you could do that business. I sat there for about 10 years to do this, because then it was word-of-mouth recommendation. Why do you think you could not start a business like this today? Do you have any idea? No? Nobody is home. You get answering machines. People are too busy. At that time, in 56 and on until the late 60s, there was nobody was working. And
you did this business until?
we started it in the house, and we ended up in the house, but my husband did all the baking. We closed down the cookie business in about 58, 59, and we devoted all our time to this business.
How many children do you have?
2,
Their names?
Eleanor and Stephanie.
And how many grandchildren?
They're 5.
How do you think the Holocaust experience affected your life?
I think it made you a strong person. If you're not strong, it made me stronger. Because we couldn't just sit back and say, well, if you wanted a certain type of life, you worked for it. And that's the only thing.
Do you still think about it, what you went
You
through?
never forget it. You never forget it. It always touches you. Like we say many times, like my children said before in my husband's tape, when Herbert used to go to a Masonic meeting, or I go to a sisterhood meeting, or any kind of meeting, somebody would say, oh, I forgot to go and say hello to this girl. I went to school with her. I can't say that. Never meet anybody. These are things you're reminded every day of your life. It'll never leave you. At least I don't think it does.
Do you ever dream about what you went through?
Yeah, sometimes I dream, and sometimes I get nightmares, and sometimes I dream, and I don't want it to end. Depends what it is. If it's good, I don't want it to end.
Can you give an example?
Oh, good times we've had. Bad times I like to forget.
But you said you dream about about what you went through.
Well, you think back sometimes. I was very fortunate that I was not deported, so I might not be here.
What kinds of things do you think about?
I can't really offhand. I think back of how we came to what we got to, and what I also think about both of us a great deal, how much education we missed, which we lack. But then people say, and that I found out, we know some people who are very, very bright, but when they passed that common sense, they were absent. And common sense, I think we have.
Did you discuss the Holocaust or what you went through with your children?
Oh yeah, they know. They know. Listen, they had their grandmother and grandfather here, and they were very close with them. And they talked. And also, we had to, Herbert and I, we were very caring about my parents. And like I never could go, not that I complain, but when people invited us, for instance, and I hear it with family, cousins, my aunt, I don't have any of that. We have no family. Our children have no, outside of Herbert's brother in New York, they have no cousins. I have a cousin in Israel that was my mother's brother, who lived in Israel from 1935 until 1980. He died. Those two boys are my cousins, and I speak to them. And the mother, my aunt, who is mother's sister-in-law to my mother, I speak to her every 4 to 6 weeks to Israel. We have no saying that my children, this is stretched out for years to come. My children have no cousins, outside of one cousin from Herbert's brother, who has one son, who has 2 little children and a wife. So my Steffi and her husband, they get together once a year. But there's no such thing. We had a cousins club, or the family meeting. We don't have that. And that's when we're jealous. That's when we need it. And when we hear these things. And so when my mother and father were alone, I couldn't say, well, my mother went this afternoon to her sister or to her cousin's house. There was no such thing. I never ask my children, what do you do on weekends? Because I don't want them to worry about me, what I'm doing. We always asked my parents, what are you doing this weekend? I was always happy when they were busy. We had one funny thing when we bought our first air-conditioned car. We came at night to their house, and we said we just bought a car. So, and Mother said, that's good, what kind? And we told them we only bought station wagon for transporting the cars. And I said, it's air-conditioned. Mother said, air-conditioned? What a luxury. I said, we didn't buy it for ourselves, we bought it for the cakes. Oh, that's different, you know. But from then on, when we had cake delivery in the summertime, Mother and Father would call in the morning, where are you going today? Because they wanted to be in the air-conditioned car with us, see? So, and there was no such thing as, no, we're going there. We always took them.
You want to change for the tape?
Again? My
Or Ilse Rose is being interviewed by Bernice Borison, February 25th, 1997. It's taking place in Canton, Massachusetts, United States of America, and it's being conducted in English. What effects have your experiences had on the way you've brought up your children?
Well, we really, I heard the sentence once, didn't know what it meant, but I know now what it meant. I mean, I learned sooner than just now. We lived through our children. We literally did. Because I never had a youth. I never had a prom. I never went dancing. I never lived in a freedom that my children enjoyed. And this is what I say. When they went to a dance, they needed dresses. They were darn sure that they would get them. They didn't, we tried not to, we would take it away from us when we couldn't afford it, but they would have it. We didn't spoil them because they helped at home too. But we made sure that they're not missing out. And the same thing going to camp. Same thing when they were going to college. We had some friends, we made some lovely friends over the years. And our first one, Ellie went to BU, and we made sure she stays there. She roomed. We took it out of ourselves. There were things that we probably didn't do because we couldn't afford it, but she was going to stay at school.
I didn't say anything, but that's why we did it.
We wanted our children to have this. And also, we never took loans. We want to make sure when they get through school that they have a clear mind. They don't have to worry about paying back. We are not spendthrifts, and they knew this. We always had a good meal on the table, but I was always looking where we could save money, and we were a good shopper, and I'm a good shopper to this day.
Do you think that the war affected your personality? What you went through?
To a degree, I must say that I always had a sense of humor, and thank God I didn't lose it.
Even that year in Belgium?
Well, you don't realize, do you remember if I were to ask you what you did when you were 16 exactly?
Would you?
There you were. You don't. It's something that's, many times I say, how could I have done this? How did I do this? How could my mother send me there? When we left our daughter at BU, was exactly 4 miles away from our house, I cried like I couldn't cry even when I don't know. Something comes over you that you just do not, and like I always say, but you don't experience yourself, whether it's good or bad, you just never, you don't understand it. Everybody can tell you don't know how terrible it is to be this and that until you go through it.
Did your experience affect your religious practices or your husband's religious practices or the way you raised your children?
Our children always belonged to a temple. I mean, once we could afford it, and but we did. And they went to Hebrew school. They were confirmed, and we were Reformed Judaism. My husband, unfortunately, had very little Jewish education, which he is very sorry about now. Whatever he learned from us. We celebrate the holidays. We go to temple. We always belonged to a temple, and supported it.
Do you have a final message that you would like to say?
That we're grateful that we're here, that we made a living for ourselves. The final thing being in Orchard Cove, that we were able to do this financially for ourselves and for our children. That we was the biggest gift
we could give to our children is they don't have to worry about us. And we're grateful the way they are situated. They're in education, they're kind, they're caring. We had enough sicknesses in our life. My husband had quite a few sicknesses, illnesses. When I was in the hospital for certain things, they were always caring about us, and that's what we're grateful for.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Could you tell me what that is?
Oh, need to talk now? That is my grandmother and grandfather when they were married in July of 1892. And this is the menu. This is not an invitation. It says to the wedding of Miss Rosa Haas to Mr. Hugo Eigelberg, July the 10th, I believe, 1892. It's a menu, and I don't know where they put all that food.
Where were they married?
In Marburg, Germany. That's where my mother was born. It's not too far away from Frankfurt am Main, and was a university city. And we spent many summer vacations there, and we had a wonderful time. So I have very fond memories of that place. And my grandmother, who unfortunately became a widow 10 years after she was married. I have no idea.
Okay.
This is the synagogue in Marburg, where my mother and father were married, as well as my grandparents were married there in 1919. In 1919 was my father and mother married, and my grandmother and grandfather, as I said, in 1892.
Okay.
This was my mother and father with my brother, and I would think he might have been a year and a half or 2
years old. And
That was probably 1921 or 22. This is a picture of my mother in the middle and my brother Fritz and myself in 1934 or 35. I really don't know exactly. This is my brother Fritz, as I remember him, when he was 21 years old. Last time in 1939.
he took care of her. She lived with my mother and father until her death.
I believe it was the end of 1940.
And the other picture was taken in America, how she looked after she recuperated.
And I believe she died in November 48. When we started our cookie business, people heard of us, and I was asked if I wanted to be a guest on the TV show at WBZ TV.
At Mildred Carlson and Streeter Stewart, they interviewed me.
We made cookies for S.S. Pierce, Stewart and Match, and all kinds of delicatessen stores and so on. These are my parents, Tessie Steinhardt and Justin Steinhardt, at their first granddaughter's wedding, which was May 30th, 1967. Dad was
77, my mother was 74. These two young ladies in front, to the left is Steffi, to the right is Ellie, and back is Herb and myself. And it was the occasion of our oldest daughter's 50th birthday, which was last year.
You're born in 45, so
October
1995.
I bet I'm not very long. From left to right, it's Herbert, our son-in-law Michael, our daughter Steffi, with her two children in front, Amanda and David. In back is a cousin who is visiting from England. Then it's Joshua and Jonathan, myself, and our son-in-law Dennis, and Ellie. And I don't know whether, no, you know, Robert is in back. It's not a cousin, it's Robert, our other grandson. You know, I couldn't make it out. I should have looked before.
Where was this taken?
In front of our building on Beacon Street in Brookline, before we moved here. I mean, we lived there, but this was taken more than 3 years ago. I want you to introduce my husband, Herbert Rose, who I have been married to for 55 years. And we're still talking. We're still speaking. And sometimes. Yeah, we're fine.
Did your husband also have Holocaust experiences?
Yes, he did. And he told it on another tape. And
Did you ever talk about what happened to the two of you?
we talked more about it years ago than we do now. We are just stage of our lives that we never forget it. We'll never forget it. But we try to enjoy as much as we can now.
How would you describe life with your soul here in America?
We're very happy about it because we did ourselves. Nobody handed it to us, right? And we worked together.
Yeah.
How has it been for you, Mr. Rose?
Just as good. That's what.
Are you looking forward to the next 55 years?
Not really.
No, not 55.
Couple of years, maybe.
We'll see. We take one day at a time. That's the only way we can do it. Right?
Is there anything you'd like to say to your wife?
I love it.
We love it.
Good. Had to be video, right? Now I got it on video. Okay, I love you too. Come on, smile. You're on candid camera.
What's that strenuous this morning?
What? What is it? It was a pleasant interview, meeting you all fellows. Nice guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now we go down in history.
My,
Okay. Thank you so much.